the Roman Empire, an entity stretching across continents, a marvel of engineering, law, and military might, dominating the Mediterranean world. Into this sprawling, complex empire, a new faith quietly emerged from the turbulent province of Judea. Initially seen as just another obscure sect within Judaism, the followers of Jesus of Nazareth, the Christians, seemed little more than a minor curiosity, perhaps even a nuisance, to the vast machinery of Roman power. These early Christians, scattered across the empire's cities, looked for guidance to the apostles, the original companions of Jesus. As communities grew in places like Antioch, Alexandria, Corinth, Ephesus, and critically in the imperial capital itself, Rome, leaders naturally emerged. These were the episcopoi, the overseers, whom we now know as bishops. Their role was local, tending to their flock, preserving the teachings they had received, administering sacraments like baptism and the Eucharist, and managing the community's affairs. But these communities were often isolated, operating under the shadow of potential Roman suspicion, and at times facing brutal persecution. This was not a centralized organization, it was a network of local churches. So the question arises, how did one specific bishop, the Bishop of Rome, begin a journey that would eventually lead to the claim, and often the reality, of being the supreme head of the church in the West? The Pope? This transformation wasn't instantaneous, it was a gradual evolution, spanning centuries, marked by theological arguments, political maneuvering, historical accidents, and the sheer force of personality. Central to Rome's growing claim was the powerful tradition surrounding the Apostle Peter. In the Christian Gospels, particularly Matthew's, Jesus singles out Peter with the words, "You are Peter," Petros, meaning rock, and on this rock, Petra, I will build my church. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. For a significant portion of the early church, this passage was interpreted as Jesus designating Peter as the foundational leader of the apostles. Ancient Christian tradition consistently held, though historically complex to verify in minute detail, asserts that Peter traveled to Rome. It's believed he became a leader, perhaps the first bishop of the burgeoning Christian community there, and ultimately suffered martyrdom in Rome, likely during Emperor Nero's persecution following the Great Fire of 64 CE. Rome's prestige was further magnified by its connection to another giant of the early faith, the Apostle Paul. A former persecutor turned zealous missionary and prolific writer, Paul also spent considerable time in Rome, writing some of his key letters from there, and tradition holds he too was martyred in the capital, possibly around the same time as Peter. To have both the chief apostle Peter and the apostle to the Gentiles, Paul, meet their end in Rome, endowed the Roman Church with unparalleled apostolic credentials. The idea of apostolic succession, that bishops derived their legitimate authority through an unbroken chain of appointment tracing back to the original apostles, became a cornerstone of church structure. The Bishop of Rome could thus present himself not just as any bishop, but as the direct heir to Peter's specific authority and mission, located at the very heart of the Roman world. However, claiming succession and exercising broad authority were two different things in the early centuries. Being Bishop of Rome often meant living under threat. Persecutions under emperors like Decius and Diocletian were empire-wide and severe. Figures like Pope Sixtus II were martyred in the mid-3rd century. While we have limited concrete historical data on the very first successors like Linus and Cletus, also known as Anacletus, the survival of a letter from Clement I, traditionally the third bishop after Peter, writing around 96 CE to address divisions in the church at Corinth, provides early evidence. Clement doesn't command, but he advises and admonishes with a certain weight, suggesting that even at this early stage, other churches look to Rome for guidance, acknowledging its special standing, likely due to the Peter and Paul connection and its location in the capital. The church structure remained largely decentralized for a long time. Powerful and ancient bishoprics in the east, like Alexandria, a major center of learning where influential theologians shaped Christian thought, and Antioch, a key city where the term Christian originated, held immense sway. These sees also claimed apostolic foundation, Mark for Alexandria, Peter himself briefly for Antioch. When theological or disciplinary disputes arose between churches, appealing to Rome became increasingly common, especially for churches in the West. It was partly the apostolic prestige, partly Rome's reputation for doctrinal conservatism, often seen as holding fast to tradition, and partly its practical position as the imperial hub, the place where communication lines converged and where imperial resources and law held sway, each time Rome successfully arbitrated or offered influential advice. Its practical authority subtly grew. The turning point arrived dramatically in the early 4th century with Emperor Constantine. His path to power culminated in the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE, attributing his victory to a vision of the Christian cross and the words, "In this sign, conquer." Constantine fundamentally altered Christianity's relationship with the Roman state. The Edict of Milan, issued jointly with Licinius in 313 CE, granted official tolerance to Christianity, ending organized state-sponsored persecution. Constantine didn't just tolerate Christianity, he actively favored it. He poured imperial funds into building grand churches in Rome and elsewhere. He granted bishops legal privileges and status. The Bishop of Rome, previously the leader of a sometimes outlawed group, was now an imperial associate, beneficiary of immense patronage and a significant public figure. This conferred enormous status and resources. Yet this imperial embrace came with significant strings attached. Constantine viewed himself as responsible for the unity and stability of the empire, and that now included the church. He believed it was his role to ensure doctrinal harmony. This led directly to his convening of the First Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. This massive gathering of bishops aimed to resolve the Arian controversy, a profound disagreement about whether Jesus Christ was co-eternal with God the Father or a created being. While Pope Sylvester I was too elderly to attend, his legates were present, and Rome's position aligned with the anti-Arian stance that ultimately prevailed, formulated largely by Athanasius of Alexandria. Nicaea established a precedent. The emperor could and would intervene directly in major church doctrinal matters. Papal influence grew, but it was now intertwined with imperial politics. In the turbulent centuries that followed, as further complex theological debates erupted about the precise relationship between Christ's divine and human natures, leading to conflicts labeled Nestorianism and monophysitism, and requiring more councils like Ephesus, 431, and Chalcedon, 451, the bishops of Rome became increasingly assertive in defining and defending what they saw as the Orthodox faith. They grounded their claims more explicitly in the Petrine Commission. Pope Damasus I, late 4th century, formally referred to Rome as the Apostolic See and actively promoted the cults of Peter and Paul. He commissioned Jerome's Vulgate, aiming for a standard Latin Bible, a key step in liturgical and doctrinal standardization under Roman influence. The title Pope, from the Greek papas, father, which had been an affectionate term for many senior bishops, began, especially in the Western Empire, to be used almost exclusively for the Bishop of Rome, signifying his perceived paternal role over other churches. Mid-5th century Pope Leo I, Leo the Great, stands out as a figure who significantly advanced the institutional idea of the papacy. He powerfully articulated the legal and theological basis for Petrine supremacy, arguing that the Pope inherited Peter's office and authority directly. His doctrinal statement, the Tome of Leo, was read at the Council of Chalcedon, 451, and proved decisive in formulating the definition of Christ's two natures. The reported exclamation, "Peter has spoken through Leo," illustrates the immense weight his pronouncements carried, at least at that moment. Furthermore, Leo's legendary encounter with Attila the Hun in 452, supposedly persuading him to spare Rome, significantly boosted the Pope's image as a protector and leader, filling a void left by weakening imperial figures. This leads to perhaps the most critical factor in the institutionalization of papal power in the West: the gradual disintegration of the Western Roman Empire throughout the 5th century. As barbarian migrations and invasions increased, and central Roman administration collapsed in Italy and provinces further west, the Bishop of Rome often became the only remaining figure of consistent authority and organization in Rome. Popes like Gregory the Great, late 6th century, found themselves managing not just spiritual affairs, but also civic administration, organizing defenses, negotiating treaties with Lombard invaders, ensuring the city's food supply, and managing vast agricultural estates donated to the church over time. The beginnings of the patrimony of St. Peter, the territorial holdings that would evolve into the papal states. This assumption of secular duties out of necessity dramatically solidified the Pope's practical institutional power in Italy. Alongside this practical power, the legal framework also developed. Papal letters responding to queries from other bishops, known as decretals, began to be collected and treated as having the force of law, forming the basis of early canon law in the West. A basic administrative staff, the forerunner of the complex Roman Curia, started to form around the Pope to handle correspondence, finances, and legal matters. Archives were kept. These are all hallmarks of institutional development. However, Rome's claims to primacy were never universally accepted, especially in the East. The establishment of Constantinople as the new Rome created a powerful rival see. The Council of Chalcedon, while affirming Leo's tome, also granted Constantinople privileges second only to Rome, something Rome never fully accepted. The concept of the Pentarchy, the 5 major patriarchal sees, Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, sharing a collective authority, was more influential in the East than Rome's monarchical model. Linguistic differences, Latin versus Greek, cultural divergences, and the political reality of the Eastern emperor's continuing power in Constantinople led to ongoing friction and several schisms, like the Acacian Schism, long before the final East-West split in 1054. These challenges meant that while Rome's institutional authority solidified significantly in the West due to the unique political vacuum, its claim to universal institutional headship remained contested. Therefore, the institutionalization of the papacy was not a single event defined by one council or decree. It was a centuries-long process. It built upon the potent legacy of Peter and Paul, leveraged Rome's imperial standing, benefited immensely from Constantine's political and financial support, grew through consistent assertion of doctrinal authority in major theological controversies by popes like Damasus and Leo, and crucially, filled the void left by the collapsing Western Empire, taking on practical administrative and even political functions. By the time of Gregory the Great, around 600 CE, the Bishop of Rome was undeniably the most powerful figure in the West, a spiritual leader with significant administrative responsibilities and growing territorial holdings. The foundations laid during these tumultuous centuries under the Roman Empire had transformed the leader of a local Christian community into the head of an institution that would dominate the spiritual and often political landscape of Western Europe for well over 1,000 years. The Roman Empire had provided the stage, and the papacy was becoming one of its most powerful and lasting legacies.